5,000 years. That is how long people have been living along this river. Not building here, not visiting here, living here, continuously, generation after generation, for 50 centuries. I am standing in ancient Egypt at the height of its New Kingdom power, somewhere around 1250 BC. And today I am going to take you through a complete day in this world. The food, the Nile, the temples, the workers who built the greatest monuments in human history, and the extraordinary civilization that held it all together. Not the pharaohs, not the gods, the people. The first thing you notice is the river. The Nile is everything here. Not a backdrop, not a boundary. The entire reason this civilization exists at all. To the east and west of where I am standing, the desert begins within walking distance. Bare, hostile, uninhabitable. But here, along this thin ribbon of water cutting through the Sahara, the land is green, the soil is black and rich, and the food never stops growing. Egypt did not build an empire on military genius or political sophistication alone. It built one on the most reliable agricultural system in the ancient world, delivered by a river that floods on schedule every single year. The Nile floods in July. It recedes in October. When it recedes, it leaves behind a layer of dark, fertile silt, called kemet in the ancient Egyptian language, meaning black land, that allows 3 harvests a year in a country surrounded by desert. The Egyptians did not worship the Nile because they were superstitious. They worshipped it because without it, every single person in this country would die within a season. When you understand that, you begin to understand everything else about this civilization. There are many time travel videos today, but History Rebuilds focuses on creating scenes based on real historical records, so you can experience the past in a more accurate and documentary-style way. All visuals in this video are AI-generated reconstructions based on verified historical sources. Before the sun has fully cleared the eastern desert, the Nile is already alive. Papyrus fishing boats move out from the reed banks, light, flat-bottomed craft made from bundles of dried papyrus stems lashed together. Fishermen cast weighted nets into the gray-green water. The Nile in this era teems with tilapia, catfish, mullet, and perch, all the way up to the Nile perch, which can reach 2 meters in length. Fish is the protein of ordinary Egypt. Almost everyone eats it, almost every day. On the western bank, the work gangs are already moving. The great projects of the pharaoh, tombs, temples, obelisks, never stop. But here's what history got wrong for centuries. The workers who built these monuments were not slaves. They were paid laborers, organized into teams with names, given food rations, medical care, and days off. We know this because they left records. When their rations were late, they went on strike. The world's first recorded labor strike happened in Egypt in approximately 1170 BC, when the workers at the royal necropolis walked off the job and sat down in protest because their grain allocation had not arrived. They won. The Egyptian workday begins before the worst of the heat. By midday, outdoor labor stops. By late afternoon, it resumes. The desert sun in summer reaches temperatures that would kill an unprotected worker within hours. Every element of the Egyptian daily schedule, the timing of work, the structure of meals, the architecture of homes with their thick mud brick walls, is a calculated response to living in one of the hottest inhabited environments on Earth. Here is what most people in this country eat every single day: bread and beer. Not as a celebration, not as a treat, as the absolute foundation of the Egyptian diet, for every class of person from the lowest field laborer to the highest court official. The ration issued to workers on royal projects was measured in loaves of bread and jugs of beer. These were not luxury items, they were currency. Egyptian bread was nothing like modern bread. It was made from emmer wheat, a dense, tough grain, ground on stone saddle querns by hand. Every batch contained grit from the grinding stones. Egyptian skulls recovered by archaeologists show extreme dental wear, down to the gum line in older adults, from decades of eating grit-contaminated bread every day of their lives. The bread was dense, flat, and chewy. It kept you alive. It did not taste like anything you would choose to eat if you had alternatives. Egyptian beer, called henket, was thick, slightly sour, and only mildly alcoholic by modern standards. It was brewed from fermented bread and grain, strained through a basket, and consumed almost immediately. It did not keep well. Every household brewed its own. The caloric density of Egyptian beer was significant. It provided energy, hydration, and some nutritional value in a country where clean water was not always reliable. Children drank it. Elderly people drank it. It was simply what you drank, the way water is what we drink today. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet was richer than most people imagine. Onions, leeks, and garlic grew abundantly along the Nile floodplain and were eaten raw, cooked, and dried. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans provided protein. Dates and figs were the primary sweeteners. Honey existed but was expensive and largely reserved for the wealthy and for religious offerings. Fish was eaten fresh, dried, and salted. Waterfowl, duck, goose, quail, were caught in nets along the marshy reed banks and were available to ordinary people, not just the elite. For the wealthy, the table was extraordinary. Beef was the prestige meat. Cattle were expensive to raise in a country where arable land was scarce, and a household that slaughtered a cow was making a significant statement. Whole roasted geese, honeyed pastries made from fine white flour, imported wine from the Levant, stored in sealed amphorae marked with the year and vineyard, pomegranates, melons, and grapes grown in walled garden estates. The wealthy Egyptian table was varied, sophisticated, and deliberately performative. What you ate announced exactly who you were. Egypt in the New Kingdom did not use coinage. Money, as we understand it, did not exist here. Every transaction was a negotiation of relative value. This much grain for that much linen, this copper tool for 3 days of labor, this jar of oil for 2 measures of barley. The unit of account was the deben, a weight of copper equal to approximately 91 grams, but actual copper rarely changed hands. The deben was a measuring stick, not a physical medium of exchange. You traded in goods, and both parties agreed on what those goods were worth in deben before the exchange was made. The Egyptian market was a daily event along the Nile River bank and in the streets of every town. Farmers brought surplus produce. Craftsmen brought tools, pottery, linen cloth, and wooden furniture. Fishermen sold the morning's catch. Foreign merchants from the Levant, from Nubia, from the Aegean Islands, brought goods that Egypt could not produce itself. Cedar timber from Lebanon, copper and tin from Cyprus, gold and ebony from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, traveling through chains of trade that connected the ancient world across thousands of miles. The Egyptian marketplace was also a social institution. Disputes over valuations were settled publicly, loudly, and with the full participation of every bystander who had an opinion. Egyptian marketplace arguments were not considered bad behavior. They were part of the process. The Egyptians understood that visible, contested negotiation produced fairer outcomes than private transactions, and their marketplace culture reflected that understanding in every loud, animated exchange. Now I want to take you to the building that made Egyptian civilization possible. Not the palace, not the pyramid, not the army barracks. The temple. In ancient Egypt, the temple was not simply a place of worship. It was the largest landowner in the country, the biggest employer, the primary redistributor of food and resources, and the engine that kept the entire economic and social system running. At the height of the New Kingdom, the Temple of Amun at Karnak owned approximately 1/3 of all arable land in Egypt. It employed hundreds of priests, thousands of workers, craftsmen, scribes, and laborers. It operated granaries, workshops, cattle farms, vineyards, and fishing operations. Every day, enormous quantities of food, bread, beer, meat, vegetables, fruit, oil, were brought to the temple as offerings to the gods. The gods, represented by their cult statues, were fed 3 times a day in elaborate ritual meals conducted by the priests. After the ritual feeding was complete, the offerings were redistributed. The priests took their portions. Temple workers received rations. Surplus was distributed to the poor outside the temple gates. The temple was simultaneously a religious institution, a state welfare system, a bank, and the largest food distribution network in the country. When you gave an offering to the temple, you were not simply performing a religious act. You were participating in a redistribution system that fed the most vulnerable people in Egyptian society. The daily temple ritual never varied. Before dawn, the head priest broke the clay seal on the sanctuary door, entered alone, and awakened the god, washing the cult statue, clothing it in fresh linen, applying cosmetics, placing food offerings before it. Every action was accompanied by specific prayers, performed in a specific sequence, without deviation. The Egyptians believed that the correct performance of ritual maintained the cosmic order, what they called Ma'at, meaning truth, justice, and cosmic balance. If the rituals were not performed correctly, the Nile might not flood, the crops might fail, the sun might not rise. The ritual was not superstition. It was the maintenance of reality itself. I want to address the single most persistent myth about ancient Egypt. The pyramids were not built by slaves. This is not a recent revisionist interpretation. It is what the archaeological evidence has shown clearly for decades, and the Egyptians left us enough records to be certain. The men who built the Great Pyramid of Giza were Egyptian workers, organized into a permanent workforce called the Zet, meaning gang, supplemented by rotating teams of conscripted laborers called the Aper, who served in lieu of taxes. We know what these men ate. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village at Giza have recovered enormous quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat bones. Premium meat, far better than what ordinary Egyptians ate. The workers were fed beef. They received bread, beer, fish, and vegetables, in quantities that modern nutritional analysis shows were more than sufficient for the caloric demands of heavy physical labor. They had dedicated medical staff. Their injuries were treated. Their broken bones were set. Amputations were performed when necessary. Workers who died on the project were given proper burial in cemeteries adjacent to the site. The organization of the workforce was strikingly modern. Teams of workers were given names: the Endurance of Khufu, the Friends of Khufu, and these teams competed against each other in productivity. Foremen kept records. Scribes counted every stone block moved, every worker day of labor. The Egyptian state was obsessed with measurement and record-keeping, and the management of a construction project that employed tens of thousands of people simultaneously was handled with a bureaucratic precision that would not look out of place in a modern construction company. Why did they do it? Why did ordinary Egyptians give years of their lives to build monuments for a god-king they would never meet? Part of the answer is the redistribution system. Working on the royal project meant guaranteed food, medical care, and a secure place in the social order. But part of the answer is also something harder to quantify. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's continued existence after death guaranteed the continued functioning of the cosmos. Building the tomb was not labor extracted under duress. For many of the workers, it was participation in something sacred, the most important project in the world. No account of a day in ancient Egypt can ignore the subject that occupied more of the Egyptian mind than any other: death. But not death as we understand it, as an ending, a loss, a darkness. For the Egyptians, death was a transition, a journey into another version of the same world. And the preparation for that journey began the moment you were born. The Egyptian afterlife was not an abstract spiritual realm. It was a physical place, called the Field of Reeds, or Aru, that mirrored the best version of Egypt itself. Fertile fields, clear water, familiar food, the company of everyone you had loved. To reach it, your heart had to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and justice, in the Hall of Two Truths, before a panel of 42 divine judges. If your heart was light, if you had lived a righteous life, you passed through. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, it was eaten by the devourer, a composite creature part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, and you ceased to exist entirely. Not hell, oblivion. Mummification was the technology developed to preserve the body for the afterlife journey. The process took 70 days and involved removing all internal organs, stored separately in canopic jars. drying the body completely with natron salt, anointing it with resins and oils, and wrapping it in hundreds of meters of linen bandages with protective amulets placed at specific points between the layers. The quality of mummification you received depended entirely on what you could afford. The pharaoh received the full 70-day treatment with the finest materials. A poor farmer might be dried in natron and wrapped in basic linen. But everyone tried. Even the very poor wanted their bodies preserved. The afterlife was not a luxury. It was the point of everything. The Book of the Dead, more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was a collection of spells and instructions to guide the deceased through the afterlife journey. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned personalized copies, written on papyrus scrolls and placed in their tombs. The spells told you what to say to the divine judges, how to navigate the dangerous passages of the underworld, and what words would open sealed doors. It was a practical manual for the most important journey you would ever take. The Egyptians did not face death with fear. They faced it with preparation. As the sun drops toward the western desert, the direction the Egyptians associated with death and the afterlife, which is why the pyramids and tombs are always on the west bank of the Nile, the workday ends. The heat is finally fading. The river turns from green to gold to deep orange-red. The ibis birds settle on the reed beds for the night, and across this civilization of 5 million people, from the workers' villages beside the pyramid sites to the noble estates of Memphis, everyone is coming home. The Egyptian home, even a modest one, was built to manage the heat. Thick mud brick walls absorbed the day's heat slowly and released it overnight, keeping interiors cool during the worst afternoon temperatures. Windows were small and set high. Flat roofs served as sleeping platforms on hot nights. Egyptians slept under the stars for much of the year. The interior spaces were bright with color. Even ordinary homes had painted walls. White plaster covered with geometric patterns and ochre red stripes. Wealthier homes had garden pools, vine-covered trellises, painted ceilings depicting the night sky. The evening meal was the main social event of the Egyptian day. Family gathered, food was shared. In wealthy households, guests were received in formal dining rooms, wearing their finest white linen robes, their eyes outlined with kohl, which served not just as cosmetic, but as protection against the sun's glare and, the Egyptians believed, against the evil eye. Music was played. Servants moved between the guests with wine and food. The Egyptians loved music profoundly. Harps, lutes, double flutes, drums, and clappers were common instruments, and professional musicians performed at any gathering of means. And through all of it, the meal, the music, the conversation, ran a thread of awareness that never entirely disappeared in ancient Egyptian life. The awareness of time passing, of the river flowing, of the sun moving in its arc, of the scales being balanced somewhere in the hall of two truths. The Egyptians were not morbid. They were not obsessed with death in the way that phrase is usually meant. They were intensely alive, intensely aware of the beauty of the world they lived in, and profoundly committed to the idea that a life lived in accordance with Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, was a life worth preserving forever. This is what Egypt was. Not just the pharaohs whose enormous images stare out from temple walls across 4,000 years of history. Not just the pyramids that have been standing longer than any other human structure on Earth, but the fisherman casting his net into the Nile before dawn, the worker eating his bread ration in the shadow of a stone that will still be standing when every civilization that currently exists has long since fallen, the woman grinding grain by lamplight, the priest breaking a clay seal before a god that needed to be fed, the scribe recording the day's output with a reed pen on a papyrus sheet that archaeologists will read 3,000 years later, the river, the flood, the black soil, the extraordinary, improbable, world-changing fact of a civilization that endured for 3,000 years in a strip of green in the middle of the largest desert on Earth. And if you want to understand the modern world, its obsession with monuments, its systems of redistribution, its belief that how you live determines what comes after, you will find all of it here, already fully formed, 5,000 years ago, on the banks of the Nile.